Hello and welcome. My thesis looks at iconic architecture in Dubai and examines its historical, political, economic, and social implications, all the while celebrating the engineering and design ingenuity that went into its conception. The sudden boom of mega architectural projects in the past 50 years is a critical decision by Sheikh Mohammed, the current leader of Dubai. In the 1970s, realizing that Dubai's oil reserve was bound to run dry, he decided to build a tourist hotspot out of the barren desert to diversify government income, all for the good of the economy. And so we have the many impressive structures we come to associate with Dubai today. Burj Khalifa is the tallest building in the world. Its height is made possible by a Y-shaped cross-section and a strong central core anchoring 3 building wings. Ibn Battuta Mall is the largest themed mall in the world. It was named after a famous Arabic explorer in the Middle Ages, and so as you can see here, each of its 7 halls emulates the aesthetics of a region travelled by Battuta himself. And the largest artificial island cluster, visible from outer space, is located along Dubai shoreline. Its construction employs the most inventive techniques. This largeness, so sought after by Dubai developers, plays into the human natural reaction to stimuli, especially in the age of television, internet, and the overall abundance of information. Architecture is burdened with the task of being extraordinarily phenomenal in order to draw in attention. But the bigger Dubai aims to achieve, the flatter its culture is becoming. The many eye-catching architectural projects that are contributing to Dubai's iconic image are not true representations of its locality, seeing that they are exclusive to guests and tourists and closed off to most residents. The truth is, most of Dubai's budget is concentrated on contemporary architecture. The government is deliberately disassociating the rest of the city with the residential quarters in the historic district of Bastakia due to its dilapidated conditions. On the other hand, the heavy involvement of Western architects contributes to the dilution of a cultural vernacular. In designing the Burj Khalifa, Adrian Smith claimed to have drawn inspiration from a desert flower native to Dubai, but it was later revealed that the association was added after Smith had finished his drawing to satisfy the commissioner's request for a more regionally authentic design. Also, just from looking at these photos, few to no similarities can be spotted from the two forms. To borrow Jean Baudrillard and Umberto Eco's term, Dubai is becoming a hyperreality in and of itself. Hyperreality describes an object or place that is based on imitation of reality, and since reality has been morphed, the place is now deprived of an independent meaning. Instead of letting the culture color the language of architecture with its own values, Dubai developers are reversing the process. They are letting the structures inform their lived experience. Case in point, a study in 2019 saw a spike in impulsive purchases in entertainment-based department stores, using sales at the Ibn Battuta Mall as one of its leading studies. This particularization of architecture here is for the same purpose as everywhere else in Dubai, to push for tourist consumption. Dubai's very identity now revolves around the breadth of its visual influence for quick and effective fascination, while the depth of regional historicism gets swept aside. As a result, a trip to Dubai feels more like a simulation than an exploration of culture and significance. My thesis also looks into the environmental degradation caused by the construction of the artificial islands, as well as the unfair working and living conditions of migrant construction workers who make possible the iconic structures of Dubai. And it all goes to show that, while the pursuit of futuristic projects is contributing to the architectural industry's advancement on a global level, it is also widening the gap between culture and future. The two notions, though not originally or necessarily mutually exclusive, are gradually becoming estranged entities, as culture represents an organic accruement of human interactions with the surrounding landscapes. The neck-breaking rate of development in Dubai is interfering with that natural process, resulting in a spatial entity increasingly void of a distinctive character. Plus, its impact on the environment and Dubai's labor force is begging the question of sustainability. What the region has achieved architecturally is certainly worthy of recognition, but arguably so are its darker sides.
My thesis, Architects of National Identity, explores the impact of urbanization and tourism on the historic preservation of minority religious venues in Yunnan, China. Yunnan is China's most ethnically and religiously diverse province, and Shaxi is a small, rural town in Yunnan that is in the process of becoming a major tourist attraction. How do conservationists define architectural authenticity? My main argument for this thesis is how conservation teams define architectural authenticity yield specific restoration strategies that, in turn, result in tangible consequences for both the historic architecture and the communities that utilize that architecture. When preparing for my thesis, I encountered a great amount of literature that attempted to explain the Chinese method of architectural preservation. As you will see in this presentation, Chinese architectural preservation is highly varied and reflects a diversity of values and ideologies. I explore these different authenticities through three specific restoration strategies. The first is the historic restoration model, which derives authenticity through returning a temple to its original historic aesthetics and privileges utilizing original materials. The mixed intervention model prioritizes maintenance of traditional temple functions, such as worship and festivals, and uses the architecture as a tool to accommodate and facilitate these intangible cultural heritage activities. The last model I explore is the hands-off model, where a temple's restoration and use is entirely up to the community that occupies it. The first temple I examine, which employs the historic restoration model, is the Xinjiao Temple. The temple was restored by an international team from ETH Zurich in collaboration with UNESCO and the World Monuments Fund. This was part of the Shaxi to invigorate its tourist economy. The team, guided by international standards such as those provided by the Getty, prioritized historic aesthetics and materials and required historical documentation for every architectural intervention. The temple, in order to maintain its continued activities and restoration, was converted into a museum. This museum is primarily dedicated to the Shaxi Rehabilitation Project and, to a smaller extent, the sect of Buddhism to which the temple is dedicated. In order to maintain its income, the temple does charge an admissions fee, which excludes community members who would like to worship at the temple regularly. The second temple I examine, which uses the mixed intervention model, is the Pear Orchard Temple. This temple was restored by an American entrepreneur in collaboration with a team of local artists and carpenters. The team prioritized creating a temple that could accommodate traditional activities such as festivals and regular worship. In order to create enough funding for this project, the team proposed multiple tourist programs that could be integrated into the architecture of the temple itself. These include tours of the temple and its surrounding areas, meditation rooms and lodging, as well as a restaurant that would be run by local villagers. The team also upgraded amenities and sanitation and created public restrooms and a kitchen for tourists and the local community to use. Unfortunately, the temple has not been entirely successful as a tourism site, and the conservation team still pays for the temple's maintenance. In addition, the county government no longer permits the local community to use the space for secular gatherings. They now have to gather at a separate, less accessible site. The final temple, which exemplifies the hands-off model, is the Buy Local God Temple. This temple is in no way a tourist site, even though it is in close proximity to the temples I have just discussed. The patrons of the temple are responsible for the entirety of its restoration and upkeep. This temple is by far the most used of the three, as locals are constantly using the space for prayer, song, worship, and general gatherings. Tourists are permitted entry to the temple, but the temple does not cater to tourists. The temple generates its income through donations, as it does not charge an admissions fee or sell items. The consequences of this model are that the community has to resort to money-saving restoration methods, such as cheaper materials and limited restoration projects. Where the other temples might utilize historic materials, this temple uses materials such as cement or low-quality paint. What I have learned from my research is, as I mentioned in my introduction, there is no one Chinese method of architectural preservation. In one tiny town, 3 temples demonstrate that there are so many different understandings of authenticity and resulting restoration strategies. The second point is that there are tangible consequences resulting from different understandings of authenticity. How a community accesses their own heritage and uses their own architecture can be greatly impacted by a conservation team's understanding of architectural authenticity. My final point is that intangible and tangible cultural heritage are inextricably linked. In fact, efforts to preserve tangible cultural heritage, such as restoring historic architecture, can sacrifice the intangible cultural heritage activities, like worship and festivals, that occur in that space, and vice versa. Thus, conservationists need to balance both kinds of heritage, understanding that their conservation will impact one another. Thank you, and I welcome any questions about my thesis.
Museums are full of empty spaces. Punch bowls drained of their fruity contents, hollow sarcophagi which hold nothing more than a few cellophane candy wrappers, and small gilded silver spheres once filled with scented substances. In their empty forms, detached from their original context, these hollow recesses can easily become infused with modern physiocentric meanings. In particular, though many empty containers exhibited at museums once served olfactory functions, curators often foreclose multisensory interpretations, instead prioritizing visual splendor. In this thesis, I argue that though fragrant substances, the contained as you might call it, have dematerialized over time, leaving only shells of their existence, there is a wealth of primary sources and material clues that attest to sense centrality to religious and daily life in Northern Europe during the late Middle Ages. As accounts of the usage of private devotional objects like pomanders, or small metal spherical containers, and gilded statuettes suggest, scent shaped the cultural meaning of objects, sacred and secular space, and individual identities. According to Linda Diet, fragrance calls out for beautiful containment. Certainly objects created to contain fragrant substances are often spectacular. In the late 15th and early 16th century, Northern Europe saw a growth in the production of beautiful containers, pomanders and statuettes of religious figures adorned with crowns of gold, and prayer nuts, all of which functioned as Christian private devotional aids. The sweet scents embedded in these objects carried a social significance that gave God and the divine a distinct and tangible presence, as saintly beings were known to be redolent with sweetness. These scented containers were not only used for strictly religious purposes, they were likely employed by monarchs like King Henry VIII during public political displays of divine authority. In my thesis, I focus on several object case studies. Together, they display that the social meaning of scent, as suggested by Suzanne Harvey in Scenting Salvation, was not based on symbolism as a disembodied language, but on the concrete view that smells participated in affecting the processes they represented. Odors could cleanse, purify, or heal. Due to scent's inherent embodiment, olfaction was intrinsically revelatory of identity, moral condition, and divine relation. My favorite case study, which I will focus on during the presentation, centers on King Henry VIII of England. So Henry VIII's posthumous inventory records numerous lavishly decorated cinnamon-filled statuettes. There's really next to no scholarship on these objects. They're mentioned in passing only in one text that I could find. As described in the inventory, each of these silver sculptures depicted a Christian religious figure standing on a base, and each was stuffed with wood and cinnamon. During the late Gothic era, the production of silver religious statuettes flourished throughout Northern Europe. They were used as catalysts for prayer among the wealthy elite. However, remaining examples of these objects, as I've included an image of here, are never identified as having a scented function. Scholars consider them solely as visual aids for prayer. This is why the fragrant sculptures described in King Henry VIII's inventory are so unique and interesting. None of the statuettes remain. They were probably melted down into a form of liquid wealth, but their potential use can be reconstructed using primary sources. As religious gilded statuettes served a private devotional function, King Henry VIII may have placed his fragrant objects on a private altar in one of his privy closets, or private quarters, as depicted here. Brought out by the warmth of adjacent candles on a private altar, their aromatic substances in his statuettes would have permeated the privy closet and aided the king in achieving a spiritual union with God during prayer. He not only worshipped in his private closets, but in chapels where he would hear Mass in the company of important guests, notably visiting royalty or ambassadors. Silver and gold images were in great abundance in these political religious displays, as according to scholars, they conveyed a sense of visual splendor. But I've wondered, maybe Henry's fragrant statuettes were used in this context as well. During Henry VIII's reign, fragrances were fundamental to the construction of his public identity. Perfumes like ambergris, musk, cinnamon, and balsam were used regularly to scent his clothes, table linens, and entire rooms. For the king's revels in autumn of 1527, 42 gallons of sweet water and half a pound of sweet powders were purchased to put amongst the king's table linens. Though there is no documentation describing Henry VIII's precise usage of his fragrant sculptures, we might infer that their sweet scents, which were expensive commodities closely linked with sanctity, served as representations of his power and wealth in political religious contexts. Exhibited in public during these infamous ceremonies, his fragrant statuettes may have perfumed the surrounding space, enforcing the sanctity of his reign and engulfing individuals in his scented presence. In my thesis, in asserting the meaning-shaping power of scent, I also worked to suggest the necessity of integrating scented substances into museum installations and tours, especially for the benefit of museum visitors with diverse learning needs. As I learned in my work incorporating scent into accessible tour programs at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston in 2019, for patrons with developmental disabilities or vision impairments, multisensory learning is essential to any encounter with a museum object. The inclusion of scent in particular facilitates a richer understanding of objects and fosters a deeper personal engagement. Still, it is not only patrons with diverse learning needs that would profit from the inclusion of olfactory experiences in museum space. As stated by Suzanne Harvey in her text Scenting Salvation, the lack of attention to olfaction as a cultural experience impoverishes everyone's ability to understand the richly textured methods by which cultures express social orders and identities. As I hope some of my research demonstrates, in excavating primary source literature and scrutinizing material culture using scent as a framework for analysis, the olfactory nature of religious and social experience is indisputable. The retrieval and recuperation of these narratives not only provides critical insights into medieval life and offers museum visitors a more holistic understanding of the past, it acts as a more accessible and equitable lens for interpretation for all museum attendees with a wide variety of learning needs.
Thank you very much, Emma. And I must say at the end of that presentation, I'm acutely aware of the fact that we are living in, I think we currently have 53 participants, so there are 53 scented environments that we are all collectively experiencing differently at this very moment. So now is the time to open up for questions. And if you have questions, please put your hand up and we will call on you in sequence. You don't have to wait until the first question is asked.
Hi, everyone. I just want to congratulate our first three presenters on some really wonderful presentations, obviously very brief excerpts of much longer projects. I have a question that I think perhaps addresses all three projects, specifically Ivy's and Olivia's, but in a slightly different way. I think it concerns Emma's as well. And that is, I would like you to perhaps talk to us a little bit about the question of resistance. specifically, I'm thinking about how in your projects you are working with, in different ways, dominant narratives versus, I want to suggest that there are perhaps other narratives, other voices, counter narratives. I'm interested in hearing more about how you perhaps have engaged or tried to engage with narratives that counter the dominant narratives, whether that is in terms of your methodologies or in terms of the types of sources that you've used or tried to use and tried to find in each of your projects.
I can tackle that first if you guys are not ready. So that's a fantastic question. I was hoping something around that would be asked here. So my thesis engages exclusively with a ethnic minority group in southwestern China and a minority sect of Buddhism as well. And because what I'm looking at is tourism development, I looked specifically at the tourist attractions for this specific area in China, and what those attractions are the commodification of ethnic minority groups, and sort of tourists come to observe cultures that are almost stereotyped for tourist consumption. And so heritage is a way to both combat that imposed narrative and form of repressive authenticity, but it's also a force that facilitates the development of an unsustainable and really othering industry. So what I tried to do was look at testaments from people who had been affected by the development of tourism in this industry. There weren't a lot of social science surveys because it's such a small town, but I really wanted to look at, in my own observations, the way people interacted with sites and really accessed their own heritage. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you for the question. That actually is super relevant to my research process as well, because, well, I think I was producing, I got very conscious of the sources that I was using, because I don't speak any Arabic till I stumbled on this project, just because I had a chance to visit on a very short visit, and I fell in love with architecture, and I just wanted to use a little deeper. But and so as I'm going through like my preliminary research, a lot of the sources are Western, and they were and in the sort of Western scholarship, a lot of focused on like I said, the engineering and industry of Dubai architecture, because there are so many scholarships being thrown around that. But then as I was looking into like the social implications of it, I realized that that was when my sources came to be a little more local. Like one of the books that I relied on throughout research was from a professor of the university, whose name I'm not going to try to pronounce right now. And I think that's when it became to me that there are very two apparent narratives going on. And I think one that I chose is definitely the less dominant one I expressed in my thesis.
Emma, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, sure. I feel like I was dealing with sort of like the contrasting like dominant and counter narratives in like a very different way than my other two presenting friends. But I guess I was mainly thinking about like counter narratives in terms of scent. And I think that there is like I kind of stumbled upon a lot of sort of theories that were kind of thinking about scent in terms of this like entertainment I guess sense of the word, that it like is this way of like engaging museum visitors in a way that isn't necessarily rooted in history, but is like I said, engaging. And I think a lot of what I was trying to do was get at this other, like, I think very significant aspect of like scent implemented in a museum, which is related to like people with diverse learning needs and like what it means for them, because it is an absolutely essential like component of a museum experience for a lot of people. So I guess that's one way that I was thinking about resistance, I guess.
Great, thank you.
Terrific, thank you. So next up, we have Evie, and then Sheila, and then Dietrich.
Hi, I had a pretty simple question for Emma that actually builds a little bit on Itohan's question. I was thinking that in the same city where, or maybe the same country anyway, where Henry was having his cinnamon sculptures, which might appear in a museum, and the smell of cinnamon would help us to understand them. But in that same city, that was famous in the early modern period for its choking smog and the disgusting smells of the street. So is there a counter narrative there to the way one maybe would want to describe olfactory experience, and how would you deal in a museum? I mean, that might be just a little side question, with some of the not so savory smells that the cinnamon encounters.
Yeah, totally. I was thinking a lot about that. That's definitely like a huge thing that comes up in the literature, just like how disgusting England smelled at that time, especially like, for example, like York. And I know that there's like this immersive Viking experience somewhere in like the United Kingdom where you can like get the like kind of nasty grimy sense. So that is an avenue that is possible. And I guess like I think that could be like a very valuable thing to include in a museum context. Like if it were like explicit, I guess like directly related to the objects that were there. I feel like, at least like from what I was like experiencing, like working as like this intern, it was always like most effective to do something that was like directly related to an object. And there's like I couldn't really find a way to connect things to like the grimy sense of the city, but I bet there are also ways. But yeah, no, that was something that I was definitely.
I was just curious because one of the things about smell, which is different maybe from vision, unless you're being tied down with your eyes glued open somehow, is that you can't escape the pervasiveness of smell. So with those statues that you have the smelling, and the same with like Japanese smelling exercises. You're moving like a bee from thing to thing. But it's the pervasiveness that the other groups might not be able to escape. So I was just thinking in terms of a counter narrative, that might be an interesting way of thinking about it.
Yeah, no, totally. I also was like, in terms of in a museum context, especially, it's like there's also that like maybe scent isn't always the best sense to use because it is so pervasive and because it is like so emotionally tinged and like impactful. Yeah, that was definitely something I was thinking about. Yeah.
Thank you all of you. This is really interesting panel.
Okay, Sheila.
Great. Well, I too want to praise all three of you. Really exciting panel. And it seemed to me that all three of you were engaging with the issue of authenticity, the retrieval and recuperation of a past culture or a past experience. Ivy with a culture that's really been suppressed and built over, and Olivia with three different religious experiences and cultures. And Emma, of course, in a thesis that I know really well, with the olfactory experience of objects, and that olfaction has disappeared. But my question revolves around, is there a single authenticity? The temples in particular were, I imagine, rebuilt over the years. The statues might have been stuffed with cinnamon and then restuffed with something else. Dubai has had a series of buildings and rebuildings. So how did you find people coping with which phase to reconstruct or which scent to recover? And is there a single authenticity?
Do you want to decide you want to take that, Olivia, to start?
Sure, unless anyone else wants to jump in. So something I found with my thesis, because it really does hinge on the concept of architectural authenticity, was that when the conservation teams were restoring the different temples or the local communities restoring their own temples, they had to essentially pick and choose which histories to put to the forefront and which histories to essentially erase. By changing the architecture, they really did change visual reminders about what had happened in those temples. So, for example, all the temples have been impacted to some degree by Cultural Revolution activities. Some parts of them were converted or destroyed. Um, so essentially, by restoring the temple to a stage before that, or leaving the remnants of the Cultural Revolution, you either choose to remember or forget through the architecture itself, if that makes sense. Um, Personally, I don't necessarily think that there is one form of authenticity, but I think, as I said in my thesis presentation, all forms of authenticity have very tangible consequences and are part of an evolving understanding of culture and identity. And I just chose to look at that through architecture.
Should I go, Emma, or should I go first?
Sure, I'll go. Yeah, I was thinking a lot of like in terms of like, is there a single authenticity? I was also thinking about like, what does it mean to preserve like these sorts of scented objects? Like, is is it an act of preservation to, I guess, like reinvigorate scent, or is that like a form of restoration? And like, I guess just like in a few conversations I've had with conservationists, like it it's I mean it's not something that conservationists do. They wouldn't like put scent back into something that once had scent but no longer does. um so I don't know the answer to the question, but it is, I guess it's something that I've definitely been thinking a lot about, like what counts as preservation. um and yeah, I guess it just comes down to like for me, like the way I feel about it is just that like, is it what what is most useful, I guess, in a contemporary context right now. And I guess again, bringing it back to like a museum of people with diverse learning needs, like scent is something that definitely is very applicable and important. um so yeah.
Right. So for my thesis on Dubai, I think the notion of authenticity is slightly less pertinent in comparison to my fellows' arguments. But to be fair, I do think that what's happening, like the progression of culture in Dubai, right, is authentic, because who's to say that, the towards modernity, aggressiveness is fake, or like inauthentic, for lack of a better word. But I do think that what's happening in Dubai right now is really inorganic, because it was the expression of architecture was rather an enforcement from the Shia. It was very much like a top-down decision, than a collective contribution of population from, I guess, like the grassroots level, build upwards. So it is not inauthentic. I'd say it wasn't. It doesn't represent Dubai's locality very well, because of that shiny exterior, all the glitz and glamour, all of the, like the tallest building in the world, the largest hall, etc. It does not represent the diverse profile that makes up Dubai's population. Like there are many workers from Indian descent, from Pakistan descent, Arabic descent, like descent as well, and they're living in a complete squalor. Nobody's talking about the majority that actually makes up people that live there, and the tours don't mention that, obviously, and so that's my argument.
Great. Well, thank you, all three of you.
So I think we have time for just two more questions. The first is going to be Dietrich and then Gregory Maguire. Take it away, Dietrich.
Yes, hi everyone. Wonderful presentations, all three of them. And so beautifully spaced out in time and location across the globe. I wanted to continue a little bit along the notions of authenticity and in a way add the question of authorship. It appeared to me, looking at this Ibn Battuta Mall in Ivy's talk, that Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, who seems to be the sort of major author figure in much of the development there in Dubai, also buys into an old European trope of travel replacement and of World's Fairs and of Las Vegas malls that give you these thematic experiences and so on. So in that respect, he connects with something that has been around for a long time in sort of almost as a global phenomenon. And at the same time, I wanted to see if you could sort of talk a little bit about Ivy, that is in this case, about this very interesting contrast between this authoritarian ruler and what you showed as the other side. And of course, he's also, Sheikh Mohammed is also very engaged in philanthropy and so on in his global initiative. And I wonder if you could sort of help us rethink and redefine this notion of authorship of him as the sort of driving force between both the sort of European themes of make-believe experiences for the tourists in Dubai, and then those great skyscrapers that, of course, buy into a race that has been around for a long time of who has the tallest tower. It was an American pastime for a long time. And I saw, by the way, after you had written your thesis, this strange project of Burj Jumeirah, where a huge tower was supposed to, I don't think it has been built yet, but it was designed last year, out of the Sheikh's fingerprint in, about a square mile big in the center of Dubai. And so wanted to see if you could sort of pair this authoritarian authorship for a whole development of architecturally of a state with the sort of other side and his philanthropic interests. And if you feel there's something that is maybe moving and bringing these things together at some point.
Wow, that's a great question. Thank you. So to be fair, from my understanding, in my opinion, I don't think he is I don't think he is a bad guy at all. I think he is very democratic in his leadership, in the sense that what he's doing right now is for the betterment of Dubai. So back in the 1920s, back when the Crown Prince, he knows that Dubai does not have as much oil as as the Middle Eastern state. So that's what he did, and he was the first one to ever even plan a post-oil economy, and all of that is for Dubai's sustainability, for the good of Dubai. And so in that regard, I think that aligns perfectly with his more philanthropic endeavors. But the thing that he's missing out right now is what he's building Dubai quite metaphorically and literally. But he is not substantiating it with the depth and richness of Dubai's history. Because if you think of Dubai, you think of the Burj Khalifa, and you think of oil. Now you think post-oil economy, but you think of the people of Dubai and the diversity that makes up Dubai's population and its history. I first ever learned of Dubai's history through this research project, and so I think it would be interesting to visit the topic Dubai's culture in the next 40 years to see where it stands, or if the Sheikh would pivot and fills into the holership of regional tourism in architectural expression right now.
Thank you. Mm-hmm.
So our last question is Gregory Maguire.
So, hello. I'm a novice and looking at this just from the point of view of what I have heard this evening is very fascinating, and I apologize for not having an academic attitude toward material presented today. But what really fascinates me about what I've heard is the distinction between the concrete arts, if you will, and the plastic arts. The concrete arts of the sculpture, the wonderful little tooled silver statuettes, and the soaring buildings, those things which, relatively speaking, are permanent, and then the magnificent ephemeral business of art that happens within those spaces. It makes me think for the first time that while we know that art, that dance, and we know that music happens and is done, I've never before thought about scent as being an occasion, something that happens and is done, and that while it is happening, it also constructs the space in which it's happening. So this is where, to me, there's some cross-reference among the things that are being talked about today. This is not a question and nobody has to answer. But I love the thought that the scent that might define a prayer space is the same activity of the scent that might define a museum space. It is building something for a moment that has meaning in the context of the squares of the box that are more or less permanent. So there's no question there, but I want to say thank you because I've really enjoyed listening to this and being pushed in my own thinking.